Okay, hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If, like me, you are here in Australia, where it's 9 o'clock at night. Firstly, I'd really like to thank Olga and the MARE Foundation for organising this great event and for inviting me to speak on behalf of the Major Projects Foundation to introduce the toxic legacy of the more than 3,800 Second World War shipwrecks that are located throughout the Pacific region and to discuss what we are doing to counter this threat. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge the partnership between the Major Projects Foundation and the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program, SPREP. Now, I'll discuss this relationship in more detail later, but I'd just like to flag it here at this point as a crucial aspect of our mission in the Pacific. Also, I'd like to note our recent partnership with the Ocean Foundation and the potential this represents for mitigating the threat that potentially polluting shipwrecks pose to the marine ecosystems, cultures, and livelihoods of the Pacific. Okay. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Okay, so with that introduction, I'd like to move on to, I guess, the actual topic of my presentation. Now, I recognise that our audience today is a combination of both the general public and specialists as well. So I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page and to provide a definition of what is meant by potentially polluting wrecks, so we'll all understand what I'm talking about for the next 45 minutes. As you can see here, I have a definition, and essentially potentially polluting wrecks is a shipwreck that contains oil and or other forms of polluting substances either as cargo or as fuel. So quite a simple, I guess, definition, and hopefully with that we're all understanding what we're talking about. So now that we know we're all on the same page, I thought I'd better cover who I am and why potentially polluting wrecks are my research area. So firstly, some of you may have picked up my accent, and I do apologise to the translators. Although I'm based in Australia, I'm actually from New Zealand, and I moved over to Australia to complete my PhD several years ago. I've worked as a professional marine archaeologist for over a decade and worked on projects in 12 different countries around the world. And since 2018, I've been the research director for the Major Projects Foundation. And it's in this capacity that I'm speaking with you tonight. Okay, so who and what is the Major Projects Foundation? Well, we are a marine research and conservation not-for-profit organisation. We are based out of Newcastle in Australia. And I just have a short video now, which hopefully will work, that explains this in a bit more detail.
The Major Projects Foundation is formed by a team of volunteers, including divers, sailors, engineers, archaeologists, and biologists, united by a common love of the sea and concern for its future. The Foundation owns and operates the RV Ocean Recovery, full capability research, dive support, and subsea construction vessel. Our mission is to provide a platform to support marine research and environmental education in the Pacific, to take positive, practical action to preserve and protect our oceans and our island communities. One of the first issues that we investigated is the little known, potentially devastating threat of oil leaking from World War II shipwrecks.
Here we go. Okay, so hopefully that worked. I can't really tell from this side, but as the video said, our main focus is protecting marine ecosystems from polluting shipwrecks and building capacity within communities to help them respond to these threats. So the first question with all of this is, what is the scale of the problem, of the threat of potentially polluting shipwrecks in the Pacific? So for a start, I guess the most obvious question is how many wrecks are we dealing with? Now, back in 2005, a group of experts came together and put together a worldwide database of potentially polluting wrecks. Now, for a shipwreck to make it onto this database, it had to be oil fueled, over 150 gross tons if it was a tanker, or over 400 gross tons if it was a non-tank vessel. So based on that definition, these experts looked all around the world and they came up with a list of 8,569 potentially polluting wrecks. So shipwrecks that fit that definition that I mentioned before. And now, as you can see in this map, the scale of this problem is truly global and just every single ocean around the world. Now, closer to home, to my home here in the Pacific, the Second World War was a maritime war, and it saw the introduction of more people, machines, and materials to this region than ever before. Now, these factors have combined to create a legacy of enormous environmental impacts throughout the whole region, not least in the form of potentially polluting wrecks. So from that database, a list of 3,854 potentially polluting wrecks were identified throughout the Pacific region. Now, this is almost 45% of that entire global total that were identified. So I think we can see that the scale of the problem in the Pacific is really quite challenging. You can see the dots on the map there. It is many potentially polluting wrecks. But what we're dealing with here is numbers alone don't actually capture the scale of the threat that they pose. And we need to know more about environmental risk. And so that leads to the critical question in all of this. How much oil do these wrecks actually still hold? Now, usefully for us, back in 2005, when they were putting together that global database of potentially polluting wrecks, they also made estimates of the likely volume of oil remaining on board these wrecks in the Pacific. And using a formula, they came up with a low estimate of 510,000 tonnes and a high estimate of 4.1 million tonnes. Now, you know, those numbers, those volumes of oil are spread across those 3,854 shipwrecks, and they are very broad estimates. But even if it is only the lower estimate, that 510,000 tonnes, that is still a huge volume of oil remaining on these shipwrecks. And in the Pacific, we're dealing with some really considerable volumes. Now, to put this into context, some of you may have heard of the MV Solomon Trader that ran aground in the Solomon Islands in 2019. Now, this wrecking event resulted in the spilling of between 80 and 300 tonnes of bunker oil. Now, according to international standards, this is considered a medium-sized spill. So if it's between 7 tonnes and 700 tonnes, it's a medium spill. But even at this size, this medium spill has been estimated, the cleanup of this oil has been estimated at $50 million US, while economic losses have also been estimated of up to $40 million on top of that $50 million. Now, why this is so important and relevant to our investigation of potentially polluting wrecks is that this event highlights the vulnerability of the Pacific to such spills. Now, if this had occurred in many other parts of the world, a spill of this size would have been able to be cleaned up relatively easily. There would have been oil spill response facilities and organisations that could have cleaned this up a lot quicker. But because of where it was, the salvage teams, the oil spill response, had to be mobilised from Singapore, from Australia. And a month after it had run aground, it was reportedly to still be leaking oil. So 30 days later, it was still leaking oil. So it just goes to show how challenging oil spill response is in the Pacific. So the MV Solomon Trader, it's become a bit of a cautionary tale for oil spill response in the Pacific. But when we look at these numbers here, we can see that the scale of the threat that potentially polluting wrecks pose in the Pacific, it is huge. The number of wrecks, the potential volume of oil they still contain, and as was shown by the Solomon Trader, the sheer difficulty of cleaning up the oil spill in the Pacific once it's happened goes to show just how challenging and just how large the scale of this threat is. So from those previous slides, we've seen that the scale of the threat that potentially polluting wrecks pose in the Pacific. Now, I want to discuss just how time sensitive this problem is. Our main focus at the Major Projects Foundation are shipwrecks from the Second World War. And this is because these are the most common type of potentially polluting wrecks in the Pacific. And also because these wrecks have been corroding underwater for at least 75 years. In the Pacific, there's been quite a lot of corrosion science work done on these shipwrecks, especially in places like Chuuk Lagoon. And they've been found to be corroding at a rate of about 0.1 millimetre per year. And predictions, well, based on these measurements, predictions have been made that between 2021 and 2026, we're entering a period where these wrecks will corrode to the point where they start undergoing collapse, and any oil they still contain will eventually spill out. So as was discussed in the Q&A before, these wrecks will start collapsing to the point where any of that oil that does remain will come out. Will it be in a chronic or an acute scenario? That is the question. Now, significantly, this period has been termed peak leak due to the fact that these wrecks were sunk over a 5-year period, and they've been likely to be corroding at similar rates over time. Therefore, that corrosion rate, it's the rate and the time at which they will collapse and release their contents is within a similar time frame, all things remaining equal. But unfortunately in the Pacific, things are not remaining the same. And this time frame may be dramatically shortened through the impacts of climate change. So in the Pacific, we are seeing increasingly severe storm events, which have the potential to damage these wrecks. The storm damage hastens the collapse from what is predicted, and it comes to a point where we say that it's not a matter of if these wrecks will collapse, but when. And we're not speaking about some time in the distant future, but potentially as soon as the next strong typhoon in the region. Okay, so I've put this slide in as previously I've been asked whether after being underwater for so long, wouldn't all of the oil already have just been released? Wouldn't have all leaked out and gone to the surface? Well, yes, in some cases, the majority of oil on these kinds of wrecks will have been lost during the sinking event or through subsequent corrosion. But the USS Mississauga in Micronesia is an example of where this was not the case. Now, in 2001, this wreck leaked around about 65 to 90 tons of oil. And the US Navy was brought in a couple of years later to remove any oil that might remain. And what they actually found was that it still held over 5,600 tons of oil. And if we look again at the Solomon Trader and we take that lower limit, it's 70 times the volume of oil from the Solomon Trader. Now, something also to note is that the 5,600 tons of oil from the USS Mississauga was safely removed through this process called hot tapping. Or you can see the divers there where they drilled holes through the hull and pumped out the oil. Now, this is estimated to have cost around about $5 million for that removal. Well, as I said before, that cleanup of the Solomon Trader cost around $50 million for the recovery of a fraction of the spilled oil. So you can compare the two quite clearly. Okay, come on. Here we go. So bringing together what I've covered so far, we know that these wrecks in the Pacific contain oil. We know they're going to collapse soon. And from recent experience of oil spills, we know there is a long list of negative impacts, some of which are particular to the peoples, cultures, and environments of the Pacific. So when we look at the list of the impacts, environmental, social, cultural, economic, it's quite clear that it all boils down to the fact that where possible, it is better to be proactive and remove the threat than wait for the spills to happen and then to clean up the subsequent mess. Okay, so with all that being said, what has been done to mitigate the threat of potentially polluting shipwrecks in the Pacific? Well, this is where the Major Projects Foundation comes into this equation. In 2018, the Foundation became aware of the threat of potentially polluting wrecks. And from there, we approached the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program, SPREP. Now, for those of you who don't know, SPREP is made up of 21 Pacific Island countries and territories and 5 metropolitan countries. And it's represented by ministers from these countries, and it's the regional organisation charged with protecting and managing the environment and natural resources of the Pacific region. So this one organisation looks at protecting and managing the entire environment and natural resources of one of the largest regions in the world. So they're a large organisation, but they have a huge mandate. Now, the issue of potentially polluting wrecks was recognised by SPREP way back in the 1990s when they were doing some work and supporting some work in the Solomon Islands on Iron Bottom Sound. But since that time, they haven't been able to harness the resources or the expertise kind of necessary to make much traction in identifying or removing the risk of these potentially polluting wrecks. So we approached them and offered to work collaboratively on this issue, and they were really supportive. And subsequently, we've signed an MOU with both SPREP and the University of Newcastle in Australia to investigate these potentially polluting wrecks. Okay, so now we have the support of 21 Pacific countries through SPREP. How are we actually working to reduce the risk of oil spills from potentially polluting wrecks? Well, fortunately for us, the great thing here is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can use international best practice and apply that to the Pacific. You can see a long list of aspects there, and these are all based on work that's been done by by other organisations such as NOAA in the US, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture in the UK, and there's a really large body of work that we can adapt to the specifics of potentially polluting wrecks in the Pacific. And now we can add to that the report that's just been put out by the MARE Foundation. So it all builds together to, I guess, to make the best methodology without reinventing the wheel. We can take the best parts of each of these. So our first step has been to refine and prioritise that list of 3,854 potentially polluted shipwrecks into something more manageable and something more, more useful. So this has been achieved through desk-based research, which assessed a range of variables of the wrecks, including how deep it's sunk, whether it has leaked in the past, how intact the wreck is, how old it was before it sank, how long it's been submerged, and how is the fuel stored. Now, in this way, we managed to create a list of 55 priority 1 shipwrecks, which are located in 8 different countries around the Pacific. Now, our next step within this desk-based research is to undertake standardised environmental risk assessments of the wrecks. And this is following the method developed by CFAS in the UK, which Benedict was just speaking about before, that British environmental risk assessment process. We believe that works for us in the Pacific as well. So it's a really great tool for understanding how likely these shipwrecks are to release oil and what impact that will have on receptors around the wrecks. So part of this, we've been able to undertake part of this work already, and that is the likelihood of oil release assessment. We've done that for the 55 wrecks. The next step in that process is the oil spill modelling. Now that's a little bit more complex and requires specific software, and we're still working towards that, looking for funding to be able to use that next step, but we are going in that direction. Now, unfortunately, while we predict that when these 55 wrecks collapse, they will potentially cause damaging oil spills, there's simply not the political will or financial resources in the Pacific to remove the oil like was done with the USS Mississauga previously. So where they removed that 5,600 tonnes and just took that out of the equation. So without that ability to really remove the threat, we can, however, work with national authorities in these countries to create disaster risk reduction strategies. Now, the idea behind this is that this will enable these oil spill response organisations to prepare for these predicted spills, and by being prepared, they'll be able to minimise the impact that they'll have on the environment when they happen. So this is, I guess, a real-world practical way that we can contribute to minimising the impact these wrecks will have with the level of resourcing that's currently available. So from our desk-based research, we've identified Chuuk Lagoon in the Federated States of Micronesia as the largest concentration of potentially polluting wrecks in the Pacific. Now, Chuuk, formerly known as Chuuk, was the main base of the Japanese Imperial Navy in the Pacific during the Second World War. So during the war, around 75 ships and hundreds of planes were sunk within the lagoon, many of these dating from Operation Hailstone in 1944. So I'll just go back to this map for you. So you can see the lagoon there with the scale on the bottom. 75 shipwrecks are located within that one lagoon. So a really high concentration of shipwrecks. Now, fast forward to today, And not only are these ships and planes one of the most desirable wreck diving locations in the world, but as you can see here, the ships themselves have become these artificial reefs. They're covered in coral and marine life, and marine scientists have investigated them, and they've discovered a greater abundance of different species on these wrecks than on adjacent natural coral reefs. So they're so effective at being artificial reefs that you get all this fish life, which is more than even on the natural nearby reefs in the lagoon, and that's a pretty amazing development and conversion by nature. But most significantly for us, of the 75 wrecks in the lagoon, 17 are categorised as priority 1 potentially polluting wrecks. Now, what you can see here is the inside of one of these wrecks, and this layer of oil is trapped inside the hull, and it's being stirred up by the diver's bubble. So, it's a significant volume of oil that is that accessible. Divers can get in there and shake it up. So, a pretty horrible sight compared to that previous one with the beautiful coral and the fish. Now, evidently, the fact that 17 of these wrecks are located in such close vicinity within that really quite small lagoon is a considerable environmental concern. Now, several of these wrecks are located adjacent to areas of mangroves, which are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of oil spills, and they present a significant threat to the livelihoods of the Chuukese people. And many of these Chuukese, they rely on locally caught fish for subsistence and income. And it's also worth mentioning that before COVID, dive tourism was one of the largest earners of foreign income for the country. So really quite vulnerable to oil spills from these wrecks. Now, the scale of the threat that these wrecks pose in Chuuk Lagoon, I think is really neatly summed up in this quote from the Marine Pollution Manager at SPREP, when he says they pose a grave and imminent danger to the people, marine and coastal environments, tourism and fisheries of the region. And it was this quote, this sentiment that was the motivation for our first field assessment, our first work in the field on potentially polluting wrecks in the Pacific when we travelled to Chuuk in 2019. So our work in Chuuk began with an initial assessment of some of those 17 potentially polluting wrecks. And today I just want to briefly focus on one wreck in particular, that of the Rio de Janeiro Maru. Now, this ship was launched in 1929, and during the Second World War, it served as a submarine tender for the Imperial Japanese Navy before being sunk in Chuuk Lagoon in 1944. And you can see from the schematic there and the dimensions and the tonnage, is a huge vessel. It was originally a cruise ship, which was then converted a passenger liner. So you can just imagine how large this vessel is, and to have that sinking within the lagoon, definitely a potentially polluting shipwreck. Now, in order to assess the pollution potential of this wreck, we undertook a non-disturbance photographic and video survey of the site. So this survey was taken over 4 days and revealed that the vessel was lying on its starboard side in 12 to 35 metres. And in contrast to the historical sources that said it had broken into a midship, it was actually intact from bow to stern. Now, as you can see here, one of the outcomes of the survey was a 3D photogrammetric model of the shipwreck. And this was the first shipwreck in Chuuk to be recorded in this way. And the model has really proven to be a really valuable asset for not only assessing the condition of the wreck, but also communicating the size and scale of the threat it presents. Now, in Chuuk Lagoon, we are blessed with beautiful visibility, which does make making the 3D models a bit easier than what is experienced on the Franken and the Stuttgart. So from this baseline assessment, we were able to complete evaluate the integrity of the vessel. And this allowed us to complete the likelihood of oil release assessment. So as Benedict was showing before, in the report that's been released, it has this kind of methodology that's comparable across the world. So we can compare the score here with the wrecks in the Baltic using that process. So this methodology was established by the UK Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. And this assessment, as you can see down the side there, looks at a number of key criteria to calculate how likely the wreck is to release oil in the future. So the strength of this is that it is a standardized approach. We can compare all of our wrecks across the Pacific to one another and then compare them to various other ones around the world. And we will get this quantifiably rank it against these other wrecks. And one of the really great things here is that it can tell us here that we have a total score that puts it into the high risk of oil release. So we can focus resources on investigating that ship over other ones that we look at which may score lower. So what's next for the 17 potentially polluting wrecks in Chuuk? Well, following our initial assessment and survey, we've developed this methodology, and we believe we're now at the point where we can approach the various authorities within the Federated States of Micronesia, and we have something to really offer them in return for partnership. So we've reached out to the Office of National Archives, Culture and Historic Preservation, the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Emergency Management, and the Chuuk Historic Preservation Office. So these are the main organisations who have a stake in these shipwrecks. So we're developing a project now to work together with all of these groups to move forward to minimise and to mitigate the threat that these wrecks pose. So without, I guess, going into too much detail, our process of investigating these wrecks follows these steps. And again, these really mirror what was presented in the previous presentation before. So our proposed work, it's really focused on building capacity within Micronesia to enable these authorities to effectively manage their potentially polluting wrecks. They are best located and best able to manage these wrecks. So with our help and building that capacity, it's hoped that they will really be able to prevent and reduce the impact from oil spills. So initially, this will be achieved firstly through working with the divers from the Chuuk Historic Preservation Office and Department of Marine Resources to survey the various potentially polluting wrecks. And from that, we will gather this baseline data. From that, the baseline data will form the basis of management plans that will assess not only the environmental threats that the wrecks pose, but also the preservation. What state of corrosion are these wrecks in? Now, building on that is where we move into this kind of concrete disaster risk reduction strategy. So that's written with the authorities, the various FSM authorities, and the idea is that this will increase their ability to prepare for and respond to the predicted oil spills from these wrecks. So with more information, they'll be able to better manage these sites. The next point there, point 4, as I said before, the real challenge in the Pacific, or one of the many challenges, is the fact that there's just not the political will or the financial resources to remove that oil. But what we can do is we can put a kind of a remediation action plan that's written with the various authorities that will allow them to plan towards that in the future, if that's an option that they would like to take, to actually remove that threat altogether from the equation and from the environment. So it's this, I guess, collaborative approach that we see as being most effective in creating the positive change that's really required in the Pacific for this effective management of potentially polluting shipwrecks. So I think, as I've shown, this threat is just too serious to be addressed without working with local people, without local engagement. And it's too complex to overcome without international support. Now, as you can see here, our mission it's currently most developed through our work in Chuuk, but along with SPREP and the Ocean Foundation, we're developing projects in these other areas as well. You can see there the Marshall Islands, although the wrecks in Bikini Atoll there are not from the Second World War, they still are potentially polluting. So in 1946, during the atomic testing, more than 19, many wrecks were sunk during that testing. Today, there are 19 wrecks still in the atoll. 12 of these are within our Category 1 potentially polluting wreck. So we're working with the Historic Preservation Office and the local council in the Marshall Islands to build a project towards investigating those shipwrecks as well. Some of the most remote shipwrecks in the world. So another challenge to add to the list. And also there, the Solomon Islands. So we're working with the various stakeholders there to start momentum towards investigating the potentially polluting shipwrecks there as well. So looking to the future of potentially polluting wrecks in the Pacific, and the time really is now. As I mentioned earlier, many of these wrecks are going to start collapsing in the next 5 years. And being proactive and taking the initiative is not only far cheaper, but it's also far, far better for the environment. Now, also significantly, all of our investigations of potentially polluting wrecks, whether in the Baltic by the MARE Foundation, etc., or here in the Pacific, can contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So working to tie our projects within these international organisations, these international initiatives, and especially things like the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 14.1. As you can see at the top there, reduce marine pollution of all kinds. We fit into that clearly. We also have the potential to contribute and to capitalise on the momentum generated by the recent motion that was put forward by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this was seeking international cooperation on the marine pollution from sunken vessels. And this really ties into what was presented before, having this methodology that can be used internationally across boundaries and a standardised process that we can all talk about. It's a great step in that direction. And finally, as you can see here, the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, potentially polluting shipwrecks clearly fit within this. And this initiative, it's just started. This kicked off 3 weeks ago and will run through to 2030. And as you can see there, challenge one of the most important parts of this is to understand and map land and sea-based sources of pollutants. So potentially polluting wrecks can and should fit under that as well. Okay, so wrapping all of this up, what I'd like you to take away from my presentation today is that is not a matter of if, but when these wrecks will negatively impact the environment, the people, the cultures, and the economies of the Pacific. But we can reduce the risk these wrecks pose using these methods and techniques that are already in use internationally. And that's what the Major Projects Foundation is doing. We're taking the best parts of what's already been done and applying them as they fit into the Pacific, into a regional context, and working with the local stakeholders for their input to see how they would like this to work. And just finally, we are a not-for-profit organisation, but we do have a considerable range of expertise and capabilities at our disposal. And we're looking to connect and collaborate with like-minded people, like-minded organisations, because these wrecks, they are a problem, and the only way we're going to solve it is by working together. Thank you. Okay, so that was a pretty fast overview of work in the Pacific, and I'm sure I've missed some pretty major details. But as you can see in the bottom of the slide here, we do have a forthcoming journal article to be published shortly, which will cover some of this in more detail. And I'm more than happy to share that when it is available to everyone. Just some acknowledgements there. At the Major Projects Foundation, we couldn't do what we do without our amazing volunteers and our sponsors and a whole range of different people who help us make a difference in this field. So thank you very much for your time. I'm more than happy to answer any questions.